Hello, Hare Krishna, and welcome to the Atma Paradigm. I'm just concerned that you don't seem to be seeing myself yet in your screen, but I hope that's now appeared. Today we continue with the Atma Paradigm, and it's part 2, and this is matter and reality. Particularly we're looking at the interaction of consciousness and the mind and the physical body and the external world. We're on to session 6, and this one is on will, volition and agency. And we pose the question, do we have free will? Now, little recap of the previous week. Last week we described our continuum of the fields. So we have this 3 fields of our Atma Paradigm ontology, and it shows us consciousness, the cognitive functions, and the physical stuff of the external world. And in the past, we have clarified that we mean physical stuff to be understood in terms of energy and information manifesting physical properties. And we explained and gave evidence that that information that's embedded within the external world can be gathered and converted into a mental or psychological form of information. And we explain this in terms of mental icons, impressions in the mind that can be passed into our awareness, or also stored as memory impressions within the pool of the mind. Now, the concept of the 3 fields of the continuum of reality provides a model for use in psychology. And last week I then presented what I termed a kind of psychological version of this model, and it looked like this. So we had the Atma, the individual conscious entity, ourselves. And we had the cognitive functions with the actor on stage, representing our persona, the character we adopt within our psyche. And we have the intelligence gatekeeper, acting as a sort of filter and guide for focusing the things that we attend to within the mind. And we have the pool of the mind, which represents a kind of whirling of all the different ideas, thoughts and impressions, sensory inputs, everything that's coming in there and being churned around. And then we have, those are separated from the physical functions which we identified, and for this part of the model we're looking at the brain and the body and senses. So those 3 different levels, and each with their subcategories as they're listed on this slide. So I suggested how this model could be of use to psychologists and psychiatrists as a way of differentiating the individual aspects of what makes up our thinking process. And we used this particular model last week to describe the interaction of the senses and the brain with the cognitive functions, to show how the mind could actually access information about the external world. And we looked at the processes at work between the different aspects of the cognitive functions, how the persona, the intelligence and the mind work together to provide the sort of narrative that is presented on the theatre of consciousness to us. So we explained that this model offers insights into aspects of everyday perception. We also talked about sleep and dreaming and states of non-awareness. We discussed the formation, storage and the retrieval, the recall of memories, and the nature and potential treatment of mental disorders. We could have given a little bit more on that, but we ran out of time. Now, in all of this, we consider the mind is doing its best to try and represent neural content, the stuff that is in our brains, the stuff that is given through the bodily senses to the brain. Now, the mind is trying to represent that faithfully, but it also enhances it. And we talked about in previous sessions how it enhances it in order to produce the detail and the quality of the experience of visual material, visual experience and oral experience that we have, to enhance it and to make it into a smooth, coherent narrative for us. So this is where we are up to now. So within our psychological model, we have described perception as the flow of information. And it's a flow of information starting with the properties of the external world and how our senses interact with those objects, sends data about the objects to the brain, and how the pool of the mind gathers that data and enhances it with other proto-physical information to create these mental icons. And together, the various cognitive functions process that mental information and present it as a narrative on the theatre of consciousness. And we, as the conscious entity, the Atma, experience that as the drama of life unfolding around us. Now, what our analysis may have indicated is how much of our conscious awareness seems to be determined by the input of our senses and how our brains fire, and what the mind picks up, and how it integrates all of that with memories and new ideas. So the picture we may have given is of the Atma being the passive recipient of the drama unfolding on the stage of the theatre of awareness. There's a truth to that, but it's not the full picture. It's true that a large amount of what we do experience is delivered to us, but we are not entirely passive. And what we need to look at is, can information flow the opposite direction? Can there be a converse flow of information from the observer, the Atma, to the physical realm? Is that possible? And how does it happen? And this week, we set about looking at what I think is even more fascinating aspect of consciousness than all the stuff we've been talking about in perception. And this is a subject that has fascinated philosophers, scientists, and thinkers for millennia. It's the subject of free will, volition, and agency. So we will be asking the questions: does free will exist? How does it work? What is the role and the nature of free will? How do we make choices? Does consciousness possess agency? Now let's start with the first question. Does free will exist? Now, firstly we have to recognize that we as humans seem to instinctively believe that we possess free will. I think it was talk 1.8 from the last series. We discussed this assumption and even some of the experiments that substantiate it. We all tend to believe that we have free will. It's sort of intuitive. Now, in philosophy and science, it's acknowledged that you have to believe in some self-evident truths or axioms in order to develop your thesis and your understanding. So certain intuitive beliefs are accepted as fundamental axioms in both philosophy and science. The question is, which beliefs are reasonable for us to agree as being fundamental axioms? Now, we started one at the beginning of the Atma Paradigm, the idea that I exist. And we added the axiom that I experience as the subject of my experiences. And we based another one, I experience qualia. Now, these axioms are hard to deny. They're intuitive, they're instinctive, they seem to be universal. So, does our intuition about free will also fit that criteria? Now, on the basis of all the experiments that seem to have been carried out, it seems to be a factor of human intuition that we each of us believe we have free will. And if it's not universal, it's very, very close to it. So within ourselves, we have embedded the principle of free will. And we've embedded this principle not only just as an individual thing, but we've put it into every social institution, every community structure, every governmental kind of setup, every legal system that has ever been devised in human history seems to have been based on this principle that each of us have free will and that we are responsible for our own actions. Now, some philosophers quibble on this one just a little bit, but doesn't change the conclusion. They quibble that, well, maybe our actual instinctive belief is that we believe we are morally responsible for our actions. But even if you say that's the axiom, you can still infer that free will is real, because if free will isn't real, then you couldn't have moral responsibility. one cannot work without the other. So the same conclusion would be reached. So yes, I suggest that the fact of humans possessing free will matches the criteria for being accepted as an axiomatic truth. So why the debate? If it's so clear that we have free will, why is there a debate on this point? Well, I think it's for the same reasons we have a debate and denial of the axiomatic aspect of consciousness. And it kind of goes back to the physicalist paradigm, and the fact that the physicalist paradigm cannot find a source of free will in the same way as it cannot find a source of consciousness within the mechanistic workings of the brain. So therefore, there is some motivation to try and deny the existence of free will, and maybe link that with the denial of the irreducibility of consciousness. So unfortunately, there is a motivation, but there is not evidence to deny free will. Now, we'll look at some of the efforts that are being used in quoting neuroscience in order to try and deny free will, but we'll see how well that actually stands up. So really, there should be no doubt about our having free will. If physicalism has a problem with that, then I think it should really go back and look at what its axioms actually are, and maybe change them and change their concept. But to be fair, it's a complicated process. And we'll see that a simplistic concept of free will in psychology, could lead you to question how much free will we actually have in the real world. And if any one of us were asked, we would actually probably find a little difficulty defining exactly what is in our will and what we're expressing in life as free and unimpeded, and what is maybe conditioned or influenced in some way. So, to explore this, we better be clear on what we mean by the various terms. Free will. Here's just some things from different dictionaries. Free will: the power to act without constraint of necessity or of fate. And of course that links back to some divine intervention, when the big issue about free will was whether humans were free from divine control. Another one is ability to act at one's own discretion, or the ability to choose between different possible courses unimpeded, and that's the crucial word for this. Freedom to make choices, not determined by prior causes or other intervention. So there's truth linked to all of these, of course. But let's go with this for now. The free will, the potential to determine choices at one's own discretion. So we're retaining this idea that it has to be at one's own discretion, and it has to be free from external influence. Okay? Now, we need to distinguish the concept of free will and volition. Volition really is the faculty of using one's will. So we have will, and when we use it, we might say we're exercising volition. And then agency is related to these topics, but agency is the ability to exert influence outside of oneself. So it is more than just willing to do something, it is being able to do something with that will or that application of volition. Now, you could conjecture that you could have free will but never use it, in which case you've got free will but never actually apply any volition. Or you could have free will without agency. And there are many philosophers who believe that is actually the case with consciousness. So you may wish to do something or for something to happen, but you've no ability to make it so. Or you could possibly have agency without free will, meaning that you are impelled to do something. You are just an agent, either against your will or because you have no free will. You could even say a machine, in that sense, has agency in that it acts as an agent for someone else or something else. Now, this week we're going to look at free will and volition, and we'll consider We just about touch on agency as it applies to the Atma's relationship with the cognitive functions. Next week, we're going to explore the ability of will in relationship to action, manipulation, and manifestation in the physical world. So, I'm going to use this term for will. I'm kind of stepping back from free will just to consider what we mean by will. So, here is a definition that I like to work with. That will is the impetus for me as the subject of my experiences to vary the content of those experiences. So it's very clear I'm linking will with a deep wish, a drive from the heart of my conscious nature, that I am the subject of my experiences, and what I want to do is to vary those experiences, usually for the better, so that I can enjoy them more, or to avoid that which is uncomfortable or distressing. So will, we're saying, is something that emanates from the deepest heart of us. And as with other instinctive beliefs we hold about our existence and ability to experience, our innate sense of free will is a feature of conscious energy. It indicates that potentially conscious energy has the sense that it has agency, that it has the ability to change something. So will involves the desire for control, but doesn't equate to having absolute control. So the instinct that I wish to vary my experiences is a feature of the conscious self. That's my postulation. It's a feature of the Atma. Now, I'm asking you to bear with me on this, but allow me to explore from that perspective, and you'll see, I hope, why this is a helpful proposition. So consciousness is not only is aware of experiences, but also expresses will to vary those experiences. And on this basis, we would infer that every individual entity of consciousness is a source of will. And we'll see how will is embedded in our other aspects of our selfhood, also in our cognition, in our psychology. But it resides and emanates from the very essence of our being, and that is from ourselves as the conscious entity. Now, as I said, possessing will doesn't mean that we are in control of everything in our lives, or even within our own minds. It just means we are a source of will. We wish to exert our will to vary our conscious experience. So at this sense and at this level, our will is free. It emanates only from ourselves. It is not controlled by any other aspect at this level. Free will has its source only in the Atma. However, it's what happens next that compromises the extent of freedom of our will and how it's exercised. So for this, I'm going to draw on some insights from the Sankhya model as given in the Srimad Bhagavatam. But I'm going to try and describe them in terms of our model here, our Atma Paradigm psychological model. Now, we've explained consciousness as having two contexts that are closely related. We've talked about this in the past. Consciousness in our model is this, ontological model, is the source of the ability to have subjective experiences, i.e. it is the nature, the constitution of the Atma. The Atma is constituted of consciousness. It's made of consciousness. Conscious awareness is inherent in the Atma. It is not an addition. It is not something extra we have. It is who and what we are. However, another way of using consciousness, and this is part of the limitations of the English language, is consciousness in terms of the energy or effect that potency of consciousness has on the objects of its interest. So consciousness in this sense of the term is naturally drawn to center on something outside of itself. That's how consciousness works. It has an interest in focusing and applying itself to experiencing something from outside of itself. And I'll explore the full significance of that in a much later talk. So when our interest as the Atma is directed to interacting with the world of our mind and of our physical being, that flow of consciousness, that centering our conscious interest on the external world is termed, I'm going to use the Sanskrit word, CITTAM. The word chitta appears in different contexts. I'm using it here, CITTAM, and to keep it distinctive in this particular context that is described in the Srimad Bhagavatam. And this centering of conscious interest as CITTAM forms the motivation for the Atma's connection with the persona. So when the Atma expresses will at its deepest level, I have an interest in regarding or looking towards or centering my conscious awareness on materiality, then there is a flow of energy, a CITTAM, which links us with that material or physical world, starting with our connection with the cognitive persona, the actor on the stage of awareness. So CITTAM determines the agenda of the persona. It is the motivational content of CITTAM. That's what determines the agenda. And we've talked about this agenda being established by the will of the Atma in the persona character. So in this sense, the CITTAM can be counted as a fourth aspect of the cognitive functions, because it is even more subtle than the character. It is the emanation from the Atma connecting with the character with ourselves as the Atma. However, because CITTAM emanates solely from the Atma, it is not a product of anything else other than the consciousness of the Atma. And it's a subsequent expression of the Atma's deepest will, specifically trying to represent the Atma's interest in worldly experience. Really, it should, for psychological purposes, we count it in the primary level of our psychology as P2. So if P1 is the Atma's will at the deepest level, or in the pure state or the free state, CITTAM is the Atma's will directed to the world. Now, CITTAM therefore represents three inherent features of consciousness. And again, the Sanskrit's not important. What I think is important is the definitions here. Gyatritva means to know and to perceive. This is a drive for the Atma, for consciousness. And CITTAM has to recognize and represent that drive. Bhoktritva, to experience and to enjoy. Kartritva, to affect action, change and manifestation. Why? To enhance our experience and our enjoyment. So together these drivers of the individual Atma produce its agenda to be fulfilled by the persona, the actor on the stage. Now, just to give a little analogy that might help, I'm going to give the analogy of the Atma and a person playing a video game or a virtual online game, whatever So when you go online, what is actually happening is your will is being embedded within the input and choices you provide to create your online character. So when you open a new game, and I'm no expert on this, but I have a family who may be, when they open a new game, part of the thing is, who are you going to be in this game? Who's your character? Who is your avatar? And you get to make choices in who you want to be and the character and the skills and the attributes and the paraphernalia that you want. Now, in this way, your will, how you wish to be, is being embedded in the video game, in your character in that game. Now, you don't have unlimited freedom to create any character or with any power you like. You don't have that choice. You've chosen to be part of the game. That was an act of free will. But now you have to play by the rules of the game. And you have compromised absolute freedom for the benefit of getting the fun of, at least for a while, being part of the world of this game. So we compromise absolute freedom for the opportunity to enjoy what it means to enter that particular world. And we make choices within the scope of what is provided. So we're still exercising will. And that will was and still is a facet of your free will. But just for now, you're operating in a situation of reduced scope of freedom. That doesn't mean that you as the Atma have lost free will. It's a permanent feature. Will is a permanent feature of the Atma. But because free will belongs to us, it is something we can choose to sacrifice for a period. And now, going back to our online avatar, all the choices I might make for my character are aspects of my ongoing will. The choices I make are now embedded so in the character, and they will continue to manifest later on. So we can think about this, that how many of our deepest expressions of our own will are general, ongoing, not related to a specific moment. That's why talking about the use of will and free will as decision making, as making choices, actually is simplistic. Because think about it like this. Many of you have been with the Atma Paradigm since we began in April. Now, I recognize that you make a choice every week whether or not to tune in. But actually the underlying wish or interest to do so was formulated months ago. So that's already encoded in your decision-making process. It influences the decision you make each week. Now, does that mean your decision to tune in today was made against your will or without any free will? No. Just because today's decision is influenced by your previous will doesn't deny the actuality of you having will. Rather, it confirms that you are an entity of will. What it does tell us is that decision making is a complicated process. So it's a complicated story how decisions are made. And decision making, of course, is just one facet of how you, as the Atma, have expressed your will. This slide is meant to kind of give us a flavor of some of the other ways that your will is expressed and encoded and represented in various other forms throughout the processing system of the cognitive functions. So your will, just like your will when you set up an avatar, your will has been embedded in the features of that avatar that you have chosen. So similarly, the impetus of CITTAM is an expression of your will. And when CITTAM provides the agenda for the persona, that is your will being embedded. And when the persona sets the preferences and the programming and of intelligence, that is your will being embedded. And when intelligence provides its guidelines for the mind's deliberations, when it acts for focus and attention, that is also your will being embedded and being affected. So all of these items are established on the basis of the original will of the Atma. That's the primary driver. Now, what has actually happened, though, is that the free and, if you like, the pure will of the Atma has effectively been delegated to the functions of the cognitive functions, particularly the gatekeeper of intelligence, but the others as well, as we've just seen. So you have delegated your will to these other functions, and they are carrying out a lot of the cognitive processing that is producing all the things that you are aware of and is affecting what you do in this world. Now, does this mean that will is therefore lost? No, because delegation, it doesn't mean you have lost authority or lost responsibility. I remember hearing that in business management, that you can delegate a task, but you never delegate the responsibility. Meaning, it's not that you could delegate the responsibility, you cannot delegate the responsibility. Because you as the manager are always the person responsible for whatever purpose that task is meant to contribute to. So if you've delegated a particular task, it's because you have a bigger responsibility job to do. And you retain that responsibility. And the fact that if, the person that you delegate an individual task to doesn't do it, you can't blame them for the failure of your job. You have to admit that maybe I delegated to the wrong person. Maybe I didn't watch over them enough. Maybe I didn't give them the help they needed. Whatever it is, I have to take responsibility for the person that I delegate to not actually performing efficiently or at all. So, when we delegate something, we have to ensure that the tasks we delegate to others are suitable to fulfill the job. The person can do it. They're delegated to the right person who can do it efficiently, and that they are being done. So you don't just delegate something and walk away and leave it. You actually have to kind of keep reviewing and monitoring the situation. And that's why in law also you remain the person liable for your decisions. And I know there's lots of defense lawyers who are trying to plead diminished responsibility for all sorts of things, but it still really only applies correctly to a few highly exceptional situations. So the delegation of our will, the will emanating from the Atma, to our mind and intelligence should be a careful, conscientious process. And delegation is a form of using our will. And the intention of our will is contained within that delegation. Hence, there is an ongoing legal and moral duty, and also, if you like, a spiritual duty. It's encouraged in meditative practices. Essentially, the development and advancement of a person's realizations and wisdom through any type of meditative or yoga practice depends on this ability to ensure that your will is being faithfully carried out by your mind and intelligence. Now, I see a distinction between will as directly belonging to the conscious person and the subsequent development of our will once it is delegated and being processed within the secondary level of psychology. And to clarify that distinction, I like to use the word intention to refer to the overall expressions and outputs that are produced within the intelligence and mind. So I'm using will as that which emanates from consciousness, from the Atma, and intention as that which takes our will and turns it into something specific, ideas, desires, plans, and so on. And I'm grouping that as intention. So this is a general word designed to make the processes of this level distinctive from actual will, and intention then manifests in its various forms. There can be specific outputs like determined ideas, desires, decisions, plans, strategies, and so on. So intention is general, but it is developed into all sorts of more specific outputs. Now, note you can have desires without having to generate actions, at least for the time being. Although there's a good chance that later on you may find yourself acting on that desire. Or you might initiate actions without having a specific desire or purpose in mind. And often when you do this, we kind of think up the rationalization, justification later. Now, some of these developments within the mind, intelligence, ego, within our psychological processes seem consciously intentional. Others are less so. But all of them will be consistent with how we have programmed the agenda of the actor persona. And they will be consistent with the objectives that we have set for this life in terms of fulfillment, gratification, and expectation. But these are not fixed. And at every day, maybe every moment, we have the chance to upgrade them, review them, change them, improve them, whatever we want to do. So these objectives that are set within the persona can be varied, can be improved. And all the rest of the flow from the persona to intelligence to the mind can all It's a dynamic development. So how intention, producing ideas and desires actually works for us depends on how we have allowed and monitored the intelligence as it interprets that agenda and tries to bring it into reality. So these specific ideas, plans and desires represent the output of intention, and then they must be passed for action and manifestation. Now let's have a little look at how this might work. So the persona, the ahankara, false ego, sets the agenda. And basically for humans and many other animals and species, it's fulfill me, gratify me, give me something to enjoy. That intent sets the preferences for intelligence. And we program our intelligence to look for and to consider favorably and permit things that our intelligence reckons we might enjoy. So this gatekeeper of discerning intelligence, or in Sanskrit buddhi, is like the personal assistant to consciousness. Or more accurately, it's the personal assistant to the persona aspect of consciousness. So intelligence is the PA of the actor of the stage of consciousness. And yep, each one of us as that actor is a real diva with a whole set of demands and expectations to make us feel good about ourselves. So generally a pretty hopeless, thankless task to be a PA of a diva. But the PA is a good servant, and it takes up the mission with enthusiasm, and it does what all good assistants do. It makes a to-do list, and top of that list is get something enjoyable for the actor, for a persona, for consciousness to enjoy. Pretty general. Now the task has to go out to the PA's team, the mind. And the mind loves nothing more than a good bit of blue sky mindstorming, and will be quick to come up with suggestions. You know, ideas, thoughts, musings, options, possibilities, suggestions, and so on. You know, and that gets the discussion going. So the interplay of the intelligence as the personal assistant and its team of the mind are working hard. The mind's offering different ideas, but it's also looking at the prospects of this working out, or the odds, or the faults. What are the problems? What are the risks involved in doing this? So there's an evaluation going on of the benefits and defects of all the suggestions and the likelihood of success of achieving them. So it's an ongoing kind of team bit of effort here, and it involves acceptance and rejection, preference and judgment. But eventually maybe some decisions are made, and they're not made all at once, but sometimes it's a bit by bit process. Output is agreed. There are desires. Now we've got plans, strategies, commands, resolutions, mandates, and so on. Now we know what we're looking for, what we really want. Now, usually these are intended for potential action, but sometimes we muse on things and store them for another time. Now, again, just to illustrate this process with an example, imagine we've got a cognitive chat room, and because of lockdown, these three, the actor, the PA and the mind, as is the assistant to the PA, are in different places, so they're just having a chat on their smartphones. So it starts off, the actor, gratify me, quick. The PA says, no problem. And then mind, because it's part of the chat room, any thoughts? Mind, yep, what about food? It's always good when, we can never go wrong with food. PA, yep, sounds promising. What do you have in mind? Mind, well, I've just recalled a memory of a samosa that we had last week, so I've still got it. I can bring it up and remind you of how nice and tasty it was and how good it looked. PA, yep, that's an old favourite, so let's work up the proposal. And sometimes the actor then pipes in, just butting in to say, yep, I like where this is going, And the PA says, okay, we've got a green light, we want a samosa, fantastic. Output decided. But the discussion in the mind and intelligence never stops. The mind pipes up. Excuse me, where are we going to get the samosa from? And so it goes on. This is the incessant flow of the turnings of the mind. Now, it might be clear from this description that you as the actual conscious person may seem to be a passenger in the whole deliberation. because there's a huge opportunity for all sorts of influences and biases and old habits and conditioning playing a part in how the options are suggested by the mind and also in how the intelligence evaluates them. But this is a feature of the delegated nature of how we have utilized our free will. And to a large degree, we have put ourselves in the position of recipients of what the mind and intelligence comes up with. So we need to be clear that free will, or the exercising of our will by delegation, is a different issue to simple decision making. Now, I want to look at decision making in terms of what's happening within the brain. And this is important because the main challenge to the idea of us as humans having free will comes from a set of experience from Benjamin Libet in the 1970s. So he wanted to look at what is happening in the brain when we make specific decisions, you know, and nothing wrong with that. It's just the interpretations tend to go astray because we are regarding decision making instead of really understanding the whole nature of the complexity of our psychology. Now, one of the experiments that he did, and others have improved on the method and actually continue to substantiate his findings to a degree, but Libet is given credit for the experiment, even though the interpretations applied to it are not necessarily his. So here's what he did. He got a subject and he asked the subject, I need you to press a button at a time of your own choosing, but I need you to note the time that you feel you have made that conscious choice to press the button. Now, meanwhile, an EEG, an electroencephalogram, monitors the brain activity. And for Libet's experiments, that was quite basic. These days, using fMRI, it's much more advanced. But still, it showed an interesting result, which has always been quoted. And here's the chart. And you can see the black line, which is the voltage of the brain waves that they were measuring. And it starts from very low, and then it rises. And the point W that is shown there, that's the point at which the experiment tried to identify when the subject made a conscious decision, which is problems of its own, but let's go with it. That's where it is. So before that conscious decision, the brain activity seems to be increasing. And that period of rising brain activity is called the readiness potential. Okay? And that is before you are aware of making a choice. Now, the way that this result is generally interpreted within neuroscience is that the brain is producing subconscious activity, all this stuff, and here it goes on for about a second before the decision. So the brain is doing all sorts of subconscious stuff, activity, and it's somehow or other leading to the point when a decision is being made. And at that point, you believe you have made a decision. So the idea is that the brain has actually done it all, and you've just become aware of what the brain has decided. That is the interpretation. Now, you can probably already see the fault of that logic, but I'm going to take you through it. So it's worth noting that many physicalists see denying free will as their way of denying consciousness. So there's certain motivation in producing this type of interpretation. But there's no evidence to suggest that free will does not exist. So there is an interpretation of this. Now, to be fair, on these experiments, I'm not arguing with the evidence, because the experiments were refined by a guy called John Haynes, and he was using fMRI, and he actually recorded the readiness potential lasting for up to 10 seconds. Now, you can see that in the red or the pink area at the bottom. But you can see that there's also another line, the frontal and can Google it, cortex, sorry, so all this activity for 10 seconds, it seems the brain is processing stuff in the motor region even. And so that's going on for 10 seconds before a decision is made. Now, it's all within the period of each trial that the subject has to do. Now, one of the scientists in the UK who worked on the study of free will, and he'd done his own experiments, and is Professor Patrick Haggard. He's a professor at cognitive neuroscience in UCL in London. And he's on record in the past for championing the interpretations of LIBET and others as indicating free will may be an illusion for us. However, in a lecture in 2016, he spoke of his work and offered a lot more balanced conclusion that maybe neuroscience can or cannot say if there's free will. And notably, he didn't mention anything about LIBET or Haynes experiments. And that seemed very strange to me. So at a break in the conference, I kind of cornered him and asked him about the LIBET experiments. And he explained, well, these are now regarded as flawed for a number of reasons. Some of the reasons are procedural, but others are because of the misinterpretations. The most important being the failure to distinguish between brain activity related to preparing for and initiating action and brain activity related to processing other thoughts. So, here's the problem. That imagine you're the subject. What are you thinking about at the time? You're thinking, okay, I'm supposed to make a conscious choice. So what do I do? Do I press now? No, that's too obvious. So I need it to appear random. Okay, I'll do it. No, I'll wait. Okay, ready now? Okay, I better stop. I don't want to press the button. Okay, I've got to look at the clock. Okay, I've got to press it. No, I'll wait a bit. No, it's too obvious. So it's reckoned that there's a whole load of things that a subject has to keep in mind. The rules and instructions of the experiment, the idea that I'm going to make a button press, but not yet. I must hold back. I'm preparing myself to make a choice of when and how to press the button. I have to ready myself to issue that order to press. I have to make a go decision voluntarily, so I have to really think about being voluntary, making it a conscious decision. I have to instruct my eyes to look at the clock so I can notice the time, and I have to synchronize that with when I press the button, and I have to remind my mind to remember the time. And all of this is being done in this tiny little thing we call our working memory, which we talked about a week or two ago. A very short and limited amount of information that we are conscious of whilst we do this sort of calculation. So really, what this shows is something very similar to what we have been discussing in the psychological model of the Atma Paradigm. That this first stage of this graph, and this is the Haynes graph, the mind prepares to form the experiment. Then the mind deliberates on the options, and that's a partly conscious aspect. And then there is a plan conceived, and when you realize that there's plan conceived, that's something you may be conscious of. Preparation for action, that's partly conscious, partly not. And then there's awareness of when you think you have made a command within all of this to press the button now. I'm going to do it now, and I'm done. So that's a conscious bit. And then there's the cool down period, ready for the next trial. So after everything is done, decision made, button pressed, time noted, the brain finally relaxes. This is more like distracted awareness. So part of the difficulty is a simplistic idea of what decision making is all about. It assumes a fixed path leading to a point, a moment of decision, and that decision making is just that moment. And then that's producing the future. That's simplistic and naive. Others who have looked at the situation realize, no, whatever is the past, at a certain point, the mind is generating options and possibilities. That's step one. And it's evaluating those possibilities and options. That's step two. And if it doesn't like the options, it goes round again and generates some more and evaluate. That's exactly what we've been talking about in terms of the mind producing the options, looking at all the different things, and intelligence reviewing them. So just looking at decision making produces a kind of confused idea. So the LIBET and the Haynes experiments now are shown to demonstrate that actually there is an interaction between all the mental thoughts and what the brain is doing. But no way can you claim that the brain is making the decision and then we're simply just a passive observer and feeling that we are the agent at the end of it all. That is not accepted anymore. So the complexity of decision making has led therefore to a huge range of theories on free will. And this chart just gives a flavor between those who are determinist, meaning that somehow or other it's all controlled, or those who it's indeterminist, meaning that there is some level of freedom. And they mix up together, some of them are compatible. And the interesting thing is that the majority of them ultimately kind of fall in the middle. It's a bit like we analyze those monist and dualist theories. The extremes just seem to be impossible to substantiate, and that the truth seems to be in the middle. There's a certain oneness and difference. We have some free will, but at the same time, a lot of what we do experience and what we count as decision making will be conditioned because of this two-stage thing. And this is just kind of linking that in with the mind and intelligence, and showing how this two-step process is included within the Atma Paradigm as we turn intention into desires and ideas. So, what is the balance of our free will and our conditioning? Well, let me tie it together like this. Free will is part of the constitutional nature of the Atma. The Atma is its own source of its own determination. It is the source of its own free will. And that is the definition of free will. It cannot be caused or sourced elsewhere. So we have our own will, and because it emanates from us, that will itself is free. Now, having will doesn't mean that the Atma is omnipotent, but just that it has the wish to vary its experiences. However, when will, as CITTAM, is directed towards the persona, i.e. directed towards our interest in expressing our will through a covering, through a character, something other than ourselves, we're investing our will in this other kind of nature. And we are expressing it because we have an interest in exploring our interaction with the physical world. In that case, our will is compromised and it is constricted within the limitations of the Ahankara persona. And we use the gaming analogy. So the same way as having the scope of our will constricted to the limits of choices we have within the game in developing or defining our gaming avatar. However, our will remains as encoded within the agenda we have defined for ourselves as the Ahankara persona, the actor. So this agenda is an expression of our free will, but it is will now, it is only going to be able to manifest a fraction or of what it could do. So it is free will, but now with severely restricted scope and limitations for fulfillment. And then that agenda is embedded and encoded within the intention, the fulfillment of will delegated to the cognitive functions. So our will further encoded within the preferences and the programming that our persona's agenda sets for the other cognitive functions. So our will is still present and in some ways still ongoing and effective through the processes that are generating intention within the ahankara, within the intelligence, within the mind. However, in the generation of ideas and desires, there is extensive opportunity for influences to affect our choice, to the choices, decisions, and resolve. So at that level of the mind, there is huge opportunity because the mind, its job is to go and gather stuff from this world. So imagine all the things that it's able to do. But even so, our will is present, embedded and encoded within the monitoring and review of intelligence if we choose to use it well. So sensory inputs, memories, biases, all contributing to conditioned. Some of them are internal, like biases and memories that we might drag up, and things that arguments or ideas that we might focus on rather than others. But there's also external sources, new sensory inputs coming in from the different situations we find ourselves in, or influences from friends, from family, from society, things outside of us that attract our mind. Now, it's the role of the intelligence to protect the persona's agenda from being deviated by these influences. But more often, we have set the persona's agenda in order to really exploit these opportunities. So better we look at how we use our intelligence to avoid biases and habits which are detrimental to us becoming embedded in the mind's generation of ideas and desires. So we have an ongoing responsibility, I suggest, to exercise vigilance and keep our intelligence focused on carefully monitoring our mind. Now, perhaps we can wrap this up by suggesting the following principle. We have much more free will than we think we have, but use much less free will than we think we do. Why do I say we've got more free will than we think we have? Because the potential of consciousness to express will is far, far greater than we are currently appreciating, because currently our will is expressed through our persona, this actor this person that we believe we are in this world. So it's just like if you think that the will of a gamer is, when it's expressed in the avatar that they're using to navigate the game, it's only partial in terms of what their will could really express in real life. So similarly, is there a real situation for consciousness in which it could express its will far more expansively? I think there is. Hence, we have more free will than we think we have. But we probably use less free will than we think we do, because we can probably analyze that so much of what we think is our volition and what we're deciding on, what we're choosing on an everyday basis, is so heavily determined by other influences, things beyond us, and ways in which we've allowed our mind to become kind of used to doing things, and habits that we've allowed to form. So perhaps we don't use as much free will as even we think we do. Now, we next really have to look at this question of, do our thoughts and desires have agency? How do non-neural thoughts give rise to biochemical processes? And is this a contravention of physics and the conservation of energy? So this is the issue of agency. Now, we have completed our time for today, so I'm going to just skip now to, don't worry, all the things, nice stuff there that we are missing this week will be part of next week. So let's go to our summary for this week, and this is an opportunity for those who are able to put in any questions. We'll take those in a minute. So humans share an instinctive belief in free will, and we're defining will is the impetus to vary the content of my conscious experiences. The will of the Atma is represented in various ways within the cognitive functions, so it is present. But decision-making is to some degree delegated and thereby liable to influence and bias and conditioning. So intentions, as developed into ideas, desires, commands, etc., is encoded. And this is something we'll talk about next week. How intention becomes encoded as proto-physical information, and how that information can be input into physical systems without contravention of the conservation of energy. So those last 2 points, those are the subject for next week. And we've nearly gone the full hour, and I apologize it took so long, but I think we might be able to take 1 or 2 questions before we finish. So one question has come up, that what is the difference between the Atma's will at the deepest level and its will directed to the world? Well, our will directed to the world is an expression of our own will as the Atma, but it's maybe just one of the things that we could center our intelligence on, or center our interest on. And that's what ultimately is at the heart of the processes of meditation, of yoga, and of devotion that are there in the Vedic tradition. The question of what are the other options for consciousness to center its will and its attention to. And one of them is the material world, is the experience of physicality, and therefore the will of the Atma is expressed as CITTAM and becomes wrapped up in its connection with Ahankara, with the persona, and producing the concept of the actor on the stage. Now, one lady says this is apt for her now because she stopped smoking and made some positive life changes back in January very easily. But over the last couple of weeks, been having craving the unhealthy things she used to do and really struggle not to give in to those desires. What would your advice be? From my understanding, my mind is getting in the way of my Atma's desires. I think you could look at the processes that we have discussed this week, Lucy, because you need to kind of think, well, where do I need to get some extra help from? Which of those aspects of the psychological model do I need to get? Now, it's great that you have this idea that, interest, I want to kind of leave these things aside. They're not healthy. They're not helping me, best without them. But at the same time, your persona is thinking, but I need some gratification. So maybe you need to look at how you are enjoying, what things that you can enjoy other than those items, which can give you some pleasure. And then for once the persona is convinced that there are other things that actually are enjoyable, then the persona can get your intelligence. So whenever the idea for coffee, cigarettes, or whatever comes up, your intelligence is able to say, no, we've kind of gone beyond that. We're now interested in this other stuff, this other activity. It's much more fun. It's much more rewarding. You feel much better for yourself after it. So enjoy that pleasure instead. So this is your intelligence trying to direct you to a higher pleasure. Ultimately, in overcoming kind of our desires for various things in this world, I take it like growing up. When I was a kid and I went past the toy shop, I would look at things and say, I want, I want, I want. Now I can walk past the toy shop and think, doesn't bother me, doesn't stimulate any kind of desire. Somehow or other, I become more mature. Now I've got other things that I've got to control my wants for. But we are able to grow and mature and develop our ideas. I think that's as far as we are able to go today. I thank you very much for joining me this week. I hope that has provided some clarity for free will and volition. It's a complicated topic, and as I say, it's exercised philosophers for thousands of years, so there's no pat answer. But I hope that you can see how you can have free will and how your will can be embedded within your psychology. But at the same time, within that, there is opportunities for so much influence and conditioning and being affected by internal and external kind of influences. So there is something definite to meditate on this one before we go next week, which will be looking at the agency of mind. And that will look at how mind actually, mental information influences the brain and how it actually can manipulate more than that. Can mind manipulate matter? We'll be looking at some practical evidence and examples of that next week. So join us again Thursday, that'll be the 30th of July, same time, 6 p.m. for the UK. Thank you very much. Good night and Hare Krishna.